It is my pleasure to interview David Patterson on behalf of the Global Health Law Groningen and the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Working Group of the Netherlands School of Human Rights Research. David is Senior Legal Expert on Health in the Department of Research and Learning of the International Development Law Organization here in The Hague. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much.
With over 2 decades experience on the challenging area of health, law and development, what first inspired you to embark on this path?
Honestly, Shona, so if I think back to when I was a law student, I actually wanted to be an environmental lawyer, but when I was studying in Australia in the 1980s, many of my friends were HIV positive, or we didn't know we were infected with HIV, and I volunteered as a law student with a group of lawyers working on legal issues around HIV. And somehow I always kept working on this area, first nationally in Australia and then internationally.
Much of your work has centered on HIV/AIDS and the law, as you've just told us, for and with a variety of intergovernmental organizations and non-governmental organizations, both international and domestic. This places you in a unique position to offer a broad perspective on issues. What have been the main highlights in the fight against HIV/AIDS?
For me, I think it has been the recognition of the importance of a human rights-based approach, and with that, the importance of community and civil society mobilization, because I think it's probably for the first time that there's been a global movement around a health issue based on international law. And I think that's what's so different and exciting about HIV. And I think this is what we can apply to other global health challenges.
Thank you. And what were the main challenges for HIV/AIDS?
Interestingly, after we had the test for HIV, the big challenge was discrimination and stigma associated with the epidemic. So that even though people could get tested and find out if they're HIV positive, and then later on they could get access to treatment, they were not getting tested because they were afraid of the discrimination that they would face. So I think that stigma and discrimination associated with the epidemic was the biggest challenge, and still is actually.
And critics sometimes point out that there is a sort of business as usual mindset and response within human rights and development agencies. Do you recognize any such examples in practice?
My experience has been that I've been inspired by the people I've had a chance to work with, always, and particularly people in the field, on the ground. This is where people are working under incredible hardships. In some countries where the communities they're working with are highly stigmatized, sometimes illegal. Their practices are illegal, and so people are actually taking a great personal risk, and I really respect my colleagues for that.
Yes. We are now on the eve of an expert meeting on NCDs and law, an issue that has the attention of the United Nations, member states, as reflected in the current drafts of the Sustainable Development Agenda. What parallels do you see between the fight against HIV/AIDS on the one hand and NCDs on the other?
I think that's a very good question. I think the immediate parallels are the value of a human rights-based approach, and also the need for global mobilization and civil society engagement. But the challenges are very different. I mentioned stigma and discrimination. In the context of HIV, that was largely at the community level, but the challenges with NCDs are global and require us to deal with global actors and global players. So it's a different scale, and we'll have to work perhaps a lot much harder as well.
Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on global actors on a global scale?
Transnational corporations, the tobacco industry, for example, the food and beverage industry, the alcohol industry. There's no place at the table for tobacco, but we will have to work with the food and beverage industries, and we have to accommodate the need and the opportunity to market food and beverages that sustain and nourish people, with the need to limit the impact of high salt, high fat, and high sugar products. So this is going to be a dialogue, and I think the human rights-based approach will really help us because it points directly to what states' responsibility are in this area. Ultimately, under the human rights-based approach, as you know, you have rights holders and people who are under obligations, the states under duty bearers. So this is the language that we are now going to unpack in the context of NCDs.
So there's much to be learned and also some much new stuff to work on.
Exactly.
Yeah. And given this, what are the main challenges facing the human rights and public health community in the face of NCDs?
I think that we have to almost relearn what we learned from HIV. From HIV, we learned of the importance of a broad-based community mobilization. And I think that with the NCD community, we're not yet working with all of the thousands of human rights NGOs out there that are tackling women's rights, children's rights, civil and political, economic, social and cultural rights. This whole broad community has to be engaged in the response to NCDs, and we've got a long way to go with that so far yet.
Absolutely. And well, this takes me to almost the second last question, which is, well, what steps or recommendations, if any, would you offer the human rights and the public health community in the global south and in Europe to help address these challenges brought by NCDs?
I think the first thing that we need to do is analyze how do existing human rights treaties and frameworks apply to NCDs. We haven't done that yet. So what are state obligations in this area? And once we've identified broadly what state obligations are, then we need to get very detailed. How do we roll these out in practice at national level? And then we need to have an accountability mechanism so that we can actually measure government progress over time and also how states are comparing, because there's a lot to be learned between states. There's already been some great work done on addressing, for example, marketing of food and non-alcoholic beverages to children. But we need to document and share those best practices. So these are the kinds of things that we should be doing pretty soon.
And I imagine the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control would be also an excellent tool.
Absolutely. There's a lot we can learn from the mobilization around tobacco. And interestingly, we now have hundreds and hundreds of lawyers around the world who are familiar with tobacco law, and it's not a big stretch for them to start thinking about how that can be applied to other NCDs. This is also very exciting.
Indeed. To your Twitter followers, on the 21st of April this year, you asked a very interesting question, which I now pose to you. Do we need international guidelines on NCDs and human rights based on international human rights law?
Well, I think they would be a great help because that's from my experience with HIV. But to get those guidelines, we need probably a resolution of the Human Rights Council, and we need to have a state or a number of member states who would be willing to sponsor such a resolution. So now probably our challenge is to look around and see which states are leading in this area, and is there an appetite amongst member states for this kind of guidance. It is guidance, it's not legally binding, but it does help in the interpretation of the existing treaties. And for that reason, I think it would be a benefit.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, David.
You're very welcome.